Welcome back, everybody, to the Denver Dzogchen podcast. Today, I am here with Joe Wagner, as usual, and we are going to start a very cool and interesting series on the Eightfold Path. This was requested by a friend of mine who's like, you guys need to do a podcast on the Eightfold Path. And I think it's a great idea because it's really easy to gloss that over, especially in Tibetan Buddhism. It is not always emphasized as much. You know, we get right into the yidams and all the fun, crazy, energetic practices and stuff, and we can really forget about the basics. You know, the Theravada schools, et cetera, really have focused on these basic fundamental and foundational aspects of the path. And of course, they're all through Tibetan Buddhism, but they're not talked about as explicitly. So I thought it would be very helpful for us to go back over these. So today we're going to kind of give a general overview to the Eightfold Path, and then also go into the first one, which is right view. So welcome, Joe, and maybe you can get us kick-started on this new topic.
Thank you, Damien. Hello to everyone. Yeah, so good that your friend asked about this so we can talk about this. This is good for every Buddhist, myself totally included, very much so, just to go back over what we would consider like fundamental or even basic aspects of the Buddhist path. Because as you said, in Vajrayana, especially these days, since Vajrayana for many Westerners has become entirely Dzogchen, and then it becomes all about the mind and view, a different type of view and all this kind of stuff. It's very good to understand, what the Buddha actually said. What was the cause of suffering? What are we doing in this world? What is our goal? This kind of stuff. And the Eightfold Path is a great way to go over that. We had a series of podcasts on the Four Noble Truths, which the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path are really one thing. It's like the fourth of the Four Noble Truths is the Eightfold Path. So we're going to expand on that during this time.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, these things, and whenever I've gone back to touch on them, the amazing thing is how really prevalent they are in every aspect of the path. Once you kind of understand that, you go, and it really helped me to clarify, some of what it is we're up to. I was listening to a talk with Khandro Tsering Rinpoche, who on the Wisdom podcast, and she was talking about interdependence and some of these more foundational things. And I was like, wow, that really is what we're doing. Like in the Yidam practices, et cetera, we are working with these things, changing how we view the world, right? And how we relate to our sense of I. That is the problem that the Buddha discovered. So the Eightfold Path is really the way out of this. And I think by going back over this, it'll enrich our Vajrayana and our Dzogchen, and all those practices will be enhanced by having a better understanding of these.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because as with all aspects of the Buddhist path and probably all spiritual paths, there's like an outer kind of gross meaning of things, of sort of basic understanding anyone can have. And there are more and more refined levels of understanding them. And you realize that everything, in one of my favorite things about Buddhism, is that everything points at everything else. Everything is interrelated in a very profound way, really a mind-blowing way. And so hopefully we'll be able to help people to see that a little bit during this discussion.
Sounds great. So maybe, Joe, you could introduce us. What is the Eightfold Path? As you mentioned in the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha discovered that the way out of suffering, which he discovered was pervaded by this illusion of a sense of self, was this Eightfold Path. This is the prescription of the doctor that the Buddha is for our sickness of suffering.
That's exactly right. And the Buddha, he analyzed the situation for himself and then for all beings, and determined that we as humans living in whether it's illusory or not, a sense of time, we need something to do. We need a path to follow. And the path of Buddhism is the Eightfold Path. And that doesn't mean that we do one, then the next one, then the next one. It means that we do all of them at the same time. And we take that as a structure for our lives in order to move forward to become the best humans we can possibly be. The transcendent ultimate human being called Buddha, completely enlightened, right? The enlightened one, the awakened one. So I thought it'd probably be good just to list the Eightfold Path, what those 8 aspects are, and then to talk about what each one is, and then we'll talk specifically a little bit about right view. I'm revisiting this all myself. It's not like I think about this every single day, right? We get involved in our little narrow view of the path, and it's nice to take a step back and be like, oh, wow. So, and then we have some resources people can can explore this with too. So the Eightfold Path, just to list them, is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. These are the aspects of our lives and our psyches that need to be addressed. And we need to first figure out like what does he mean by view? And then what is right versus wrong view? What is there to be adopted and what is there to be let go of? And if these things aren't looked at, then we have no idea what we're supposed to be doing. And then we might be trying to meditate, but we're not even sure why and what's happening. So this is very fundamental, foundational stuff that helps us to see, my life does have a meaning. My path does lead somewhere. And once you know about the end of the path, then you're sort of living in it then, right? It's kind of like if you go on vacation, if you're going to go to, say, Paris, you may never have been to Paris, but as soon as you make a plan, I'm going to go to Paris, then there's all the process of that. You buying tickets, figuring out where am I going to stay, what is the history of Paris, what are the things to see, and then you're kind of in Paris, even though you're not going to Paris for 6 months. This is like that. By looking at the path, we kind of see the fruition, and then we can live in the light of the fruition, even if we're still, beginners like I am. So at least that's how I look at it.
Yeah.
So anyway, just to go over those very briefly so that we know what we're really talking about. We say right view. This is an understanding in a general sense of the Four Noble Truths. What is life? It's got suffering in it. What is the cause and so forth? Understanding impermanence and the true lack of self even in a general way. That's the right view. We're going to talk more about that. Right intention is aspiring toward positivity, trying to be free from greed and hatred and desire and so forth. Right speech is letting go of our tendency to speak negatively, harshly, cursing, gossiping, this kind of thing, which is a distraction from the path, and adopting positive ways of interacting verbally, both in our own minds, talking to ourselves, which we're constantly doing, and talking to others as well. Right action has to do with ethical conduct, avoiding things like killing and doing things like being generous, so forth. That specifically fits with the 6 paramitas and that kind of thing. Right livelihood, even if you are independently wealthy, what does that mean? It means you are invested in the stock market. You need to be invested wisely. You need to be doing things that are positive. Most of us are not in that situation. I'm certainly not. And we have to work for a living. So adopting a kind of a livelihood that's positive. You're not a professional assassin or thief or something that has real negative effects. You're trying to live as positively in your livelihood as you can. I think that's very important. Right effort means on a daily, hourly, minute-to-minute basis, what we're putting our energy into and what we're putting our energy not into. We're letting go of things like pornography as a gross example, and adopting things like having a positive view generally of the world and so forth like that. Like what are we doing? That's number 6. Mindfulness is paying attention, learning to pay attention, which is really the main thing in all of our levels, right? Physically, we pay attention to what we eat and how we exercise. Emotionally, we pay attention to our arising emotions. We allow those and so forth. This is a whole topic of how to deal with our emotional life. Mentally, we're paying attention to what's going on. We're not just drifting off in some fantasy of what we wish were happening and so forth. Mindfulness is being attentiveness. And finally, right concentration, which has to do with meditation. Mental discipline of focusing our minds in the right way on the right topics, letting go of the eternal focus we have on me, I, and so forth, and then moving along. So, right view, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration, they kind of embrace the whole of our lives, our outer physical lives, all the way to our most subtle internal mental lives. That's what the Eightfold Path is really about.
I wanted to mention I had this, I've thought for a lot of years about like, okay, if we have like karma in Buddhism and the sense of self is the fundamental error, why is good action better than harmful action, right? And so I've thought about this for a long time, and it sort of came to me that the strongest sense of self is involved with the most harmful activities, right? If you're incredibly lusty, greedy, aggressive, you have a very strong sense of self. If you are incredibly kind, generous, putting other people first, being careful with your speech, all these things, you have less of a sense of self because you're more connected to others. So yeah, that was really helpful for me to understand, because I think that Buddhism could easily slip into nihilism if you don't have an understanding of why we're not just abandoning karma. Like there can be this idea that all I have to do is see there's no self, and then it doesn't matter what I do. Yeah, like that could be an easy trap, and because a lot of these things have to do with ethics, it really. And so I wanted to just put that out there, that there is a reason for being ethical in Buddhism. It supports that awakening, helps move you in the direction of that realization of emptiness. It's not just nicety based on social customs, which is what was a
Beautifully said.
concern to me. Yeah.
Beautifully said. Yeah. It also makes our lives easier and better when we have a more deep understanding of what brings benefit to ourselves and others. Buddhism is about extracting yourself from the worst kinds of suffering and moving toward absolute freedom and escape from suffering in a permanent way. And the Eightfold Path is the way to do that. And you're exactly right. We live in a world right now where what is considered good is whatever feels good and whatever I can get away with. And we're even seeing that at a governmental level right now, where it's just like, how much can we get away with? It's a very crass and coarse way to look at life. And as everyone can see, it has tremendous negative effects for everybody involved. And we're trying to do the opposite of that. It's important, I think, to just state that Buddhism in general is kind of the opposite of regular life. As in the old saying, it's easy for a stone to roll downhill. It's hard for a stone to roll uphill. Ask Sisyphus. He's been busy with that for many thousands of years. And it's very difficult, right? But that's what's required. We need to get our body, speech, and mind in alignment with what is good, in order that we have enough energy and enough motivation to roll this stone uphill. Otherwise, we just dissipate. Everybody wants to do the same thing, do what's pleasurable, right? And drinking alcohol and getting high and laying around are in, at least in a short-term sense, very pleasurable. And there's nothing wrong with experiencing pleasure. But if we only do that, then we don't move forward, right? Our lives become animalistic in a sense. How do we pull ourselves out of that? That's what the Eightfold Path is about. And when
Not to mention all those things wear out, right? Like the hedonistic approach, the problem is that all those things stop working. They work for a minute and then they don't work anymore. And this is part of what the Buddha taught of the suffering of change, right? He wasn't saying that it wasn't pleasurable. He's saying that the pleasure now leaves you feeling worse afterwards. Absolutely. And that's the real problem.
And this whole thing boils down to the first of the Eightfold Path, the first aspect. If you get this, the rest is, well, it might not be easy. It is very straightforward, and that does make it easier. And that is right view. So right view in Buddhism is what we're going to talk about a little bit today. It has to do with understanding the truth of the situation, which Buddhists put as the Four Noble Truths, as we discussed in our previous podcasts. The nature of reality, to some degree, whatever way we can come to see that, as deeply as we can come to see that. And then the facts of the matter, which are impermanence, like you were just talking about, and the fact of the nature of the self being empty. These things constitute right view, and they can be understood in a superficial way, which we'll try to cover today, so people have a general sense of what this means, infinitely more and more subtly, until you really see, like, oh wow, it's so this is the whole package. If we just have a right view, which is of course what Dzogchen says, as soon as you adopt the view, which in Dzogchen is recognition of the emptiness of the self in a direct way, then all of your other problems become much less, right? So it's a very, very important thing, a very profound thing. It's not the whole of the path, but it is a very fundamental aspect of the path.
Totally. And so from my understanding, that it boils down to interdependence, right? And co-emergent arising. So maybe you could, these are really sophisticated philosophical concepts, but they're so important. We talked about the Ye Dharma mantra, which encapsulates this whole right view. So could you tell us a little bit, what exactly does it mean that things are co-emergent, right? That word, it can be a little bit like, what? But it
Yeah.
really is profound.
What it means is that our experience, in a general sense,
Mhm.
if a real Kempo or someone who really knows could go into great detail about this. I'm not capable of doing that without a little bit more research, but in general, it means how our experience of the world relates to our experience of ourselves. Co-emergence has to do with we live in a world where we believe that we're over here and the world is over there. And this is true to some degree, of course, in a standard way. Of course, that's true. I'm not the house across the street. I'm not you, and so forth. Of course, in a relative level, as we become more subtle in our understanding, we realize that wow, actually, my ideas about myself and so forth are directly related to the world out there. And it isn't like a 1-2 thing, it's a 1-1 thing.
Mhm.
Co-emergent, there are two aspects of ignorance, and the main one that we deal with on the path is co-emergent ignorance. The idea that as we make a separation between myself and other, we believe in ourselves, then other things arise, and they arise either as things we want, things we do not want, or things to ignore because we can get toward the things we do want. And these three aspects, seeing things as desirable, seeing things as repellent, and seeing things as to be ignored, are the three poisons, right? And they arise interdependently, co-emergently with my own view of myself. So when we change our view of ourselves, we adopt a view, a philosophical, a psychological view that's more in accord with the truth, with reality, then our experience of the world changes from one of primarily fear and anger to one of embracing and in participatory joy with the world that we live in. And this is, of course, what the spiritual path is about.
And I love that you said it, because when we do the grasping and the pushing and the ignoring, oftentimes we're not paying attention to I at all. But as you said, when we push, grab, or ignore, there's an I implied, and that's that co-emergent thing you're
An
talking about.
assumpted I, right? We just
Yeah.
assume I exist, and therefore, and what Buddhism mostly is about is looking at what is really real, right?
Mhm.
Buddha means the awakened one. What did he awaken to? The truth, the actual situation as it is. Not a way he wanted it to be, not a way we can manipulate the world into being, but how things are really. And what he
Mhm.
saw under that tree and for the rest of his life, and what all Buddhists seek to see, is that what we assume to be the case, that I really exist, I'm really over here, I'm really separate from you and from my experience of the world, that's not true. It's not accurate. And so meditation is about becoming more and more familiar with what is true. And that's and having the right view makes meditation effective. One of my teachers says, if you don't have a right view, whatever meditation you do is wrong. I think in some ways he's got a point, definite. And so we need to understand, like, where are we really coming from? And when we do that, when we apply our minds, our emotions, and so forth, our intellect, our SEM, to an understanding of the world that is more in accord with reality. Ultimate reality, of course, is beyond words, but we can get a general sense of how things are in an intellectual way. Then it's much easier to apply the path, and the path has real benefit. So, we can change how we interact with people. We can benefit people in a more obvious and complete way.
Yeah. And it's not just that we're dumb, right? Like the world appears different than it is, right? Like the obvious appearance of things is that there's an I here and other things there. That's why it took the power of meditation and insight put together to see through what it seems to be. And then that's the real problem, is that it seems like this, but it's really like that. We
Yeah.
have to look closer, similar to a dream, that it's not immediately obvious that it's a dream. You have to look at it a little more carefully to notice, oh, there's not really an agent here. and that is the assumption that we all are making, and it's not for no reason. There is the feeling that there is an I, but
Yeah.
when examined, it falls apart.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that insight is the whole, I don't know if I want to say the point of Buddhism, but it's a very bound up very deeply with what Buddhism is really about. Because what is Buddhism? Buddhism is just right living, right? It's just a name for how to live your life in the most beneficial possible way, beneficial for your imaginary self and beneficial for all other beings. And that harmony that we're shooting for has to do with having a psychological and intellectual and a mental, emotional view of the world that's more in accord with the way things are than not. What we're taught in school is you are separate from everyone else, you're unique, which is in a sense true, but not in the sense they mean usually. And you need to emphasize that. You need to get out there and be better than everyone else and find your dreams and accomplish them. This is I don't know, it's a little bit absurd, you know?
Mhm.
What the Buddha realized is that this idea, this self that we think we have doesn't really exist. And exploring that can free you from that and make your experience of reality a little bit more fulfilling and complete. And it can eventually lead to complete termination of your experience of this kind of suffering that's based on thinking you exist separately from everything else, right? So, how do we do that? First, we have to have the courage to look at the situation as it actually is. The first noble truth of Buddhism is that suffering is inescapable. That in suffering here, the word translated is dukkha. Dukkha means more like dissatisfaction than it does like abject suffering. Suffering is like getting poked in the eye, where you, like that's it. That's not exactly what we're talking about because you can avoid eye pokes pretty much. What you can't
Yeah.
avoid is the general sense that you're not fully satisfied, which is part of every experience of life. The Buddha pointed that out, and most people who hear that, they think this is the most negative thing I've ever heard in my life. But it's actually a door out of suffering in a permanent way. How awesome. So the
Yeah.
first thing we have to do is have the courage and willingness to look at the situation in a in as dispassionate a way as possible. If we don't do that, then we're just going to be driven around by our wants and so forth. So first we have to say, like, is it really true that dukkha, dissatisfaction, is really a part of life? Or can we somehow arrange things so we don't have dissatisfaction? Well, due to this other aspect of the Four Noble Truths, this sub aspect of Buddhism, which is impermanence, we realize, oh, because all compounded things, all things that are built out of parts, have inherent in them their own dissolution or coming apart, they cannot be relied upon to bring us any kind of eternal happiness. It doesn't matter whether it's our relationship to our parents, unfortunately, or even our own selves. These bodies don't last. Other people's bodies don't last. Our bodies don't last. Therefore, any kind of union with our mothers when we're very young, or with our partners when we get older, or with our bosses at work are all going to come apart eventually. If we just say that only that, this can lead to a sense of desperation, of terror, and but if we look at it a little more deeply, we realize that by studying this, by allowing ourselves to see impermanence, then we sort of loosen our grip a little bit. And it's that loosening of the grip, which is the point of practicing these aspects of the path.
Mhm. And the yeah, I think what the despair comes in is then you have this other idea of what we might call nothing, right? There's this idea of nothing, which is another concept, which is another trap, just like the I was, that we want to avoid when we're looking here. The Buddha never said that we are nothing. That is not the teaching. Because things are empty, and this is one of my favorite quotes that stuck with me forever. Thich Nhat Hanh said, anytime you say the word empty or emptiness, you need to say empty of what? And what is the answer to that question? Empty of a separate self. And
Mhm.
so my brain does this. He trained me pretty well with that. That anytime I hear the word emptiness, I think empty of a self, not emptiness as if it was a nothing, right? And so as you're
What
talking
a
about this,
vacuum. Right.
yeah,
What a vacuum.
as we loosen our grip, we're getting in touch with emptiness. And as we talked about co-emergent arising, this is actually interdependence, right? So connection as much as it is, not nothing, it's actually connectedness.
Right.
So it shouldn't be something to fear, although it could if you follow that, what would be a wrong view in
Mhm.
turning into something called nothing.
Yeah, we're not escaping from things into not anything. That has nothing to do with Buddhism. Yeah, what we're doing is we're becoming more aware of the situation as it is,
Mm.
as it is, and that our sense of self arises in independence with the outside world. The outside world arises, and we also arise. That's called co-emergence, right? Like we were talking about before. If you think about yourself in sleep, you still exist in sleep just as much, but you don't see anything, you don't hear anything, you don't feel anything, you don't have any thoughts, you don't have any memories, you don't have any emotions. And so we could say that's nothing, but it's actually not nothing because we're still, there's a basic kind of sentience or awareness that's present. And if you practice, the various kinds of luminosity yoga, you can experience this directly. It's quite an awakening experience to realize that I exist separate from my experience of the world.
Yeah.
Wow. And when that happens, or the very possibility of that happening allows us to realize that the goal of the Eightfold Path, the goal of the Buddhist path generally, of all spiritual paths, is actually freedom. It's liberation from confusion, because it's the confusion, the believing something to be how it is not, that causes the problems, right? It causes the dukkha, the dissatisfaction. And so, right view has to do with, first of all, setting up the conditions in which this kind of freedom can arise.
hmm And so when the Buddha looked and saw that there wasn't an I, what he saw that there were heaps, right? That's the word he uses, heaps of things. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what is it that we are? What is the right view of things as they appear? Because it's not nothing. So what is it?
I don't know if I'm qualified to talk about that, to tell you the truth. I think that it's important to recognize that even for the Buddha, that thing is not a thing. What is a thing? A thing is something that has an outline. This is a
Yeah.
thing. It's got a color, it's got a shape, it's over there, it's made out of something, it's got a texture if you touch it, it's got a certain degree of hardness, whatever. What the Buddha showed us and what we discovered through our practice of meditation is that we think, we are sort of assume, not even think, but we assume that we are a thing,
Yeah.
but we're actually not. We are more of a field of awareness than we are an object that's separate from other objects. In fact, we have very little in common with this. We don't, when we hunt for ourselves through the practice of shamatha and vipassana and the guidance of our teachers, we find that, oh, I thought I was a Joe, but Joe is just a sound. It's just a name. So what am I separate from Joe? Well, I'm a man, right? But, in sleep, I'm not a man, nor am I a woman. So what am I really? You discover it's actually a mystery. I think this is an important thing to understand for myself and for our listeners that, you know, the discovery of the non-self is not a discovery of a different type of self that just doesn't look like Joe. It's a
Yeah.
very profound insight into the inexpressibility of the actual truth. Because people
Mhm.
kind of think like, oh, I just need to discover what my real self is and I'll be okay. Well, yes, but that's not the most subtle understanding. So I just wanted to state that. So when
Mhm.
we look, what are we really? We can't be our bodies because our bodies are constantly changing. And this body that I have right now is not the body I had when I was 30, which is not the body I had when I was 5, which was not the body I had when I was born. Those are very different. And if I'm my body, then I must not be the same, but I certainly feel like the same. So what's going on there? It's this kind of inquiry that leads to
Mhm.
our a true understanding. It isn't so much looking for an answer or adopting a belief like, oh, the Buddha said this, so it must be true. That's all. No, it's about a continual exploration. And in a sense, Buddhists in Tibet call each other insiders, not because we're inside, you guys are outside, but because we seek these answers internally. So another way to put it, which I sometimes I like to say, is the spiritual path is not this. It's just a 180-degree turn from going outward to looking this way.
Mhm.
When we do that, we cast off the worldly views of what we are, like our body and our gender and our uh, philosophical or political views or whatever, and we look more and more deeply into who we actually are. And that is what the Buddha put forth as uh, the true nature of the non-self. Is this mystery, I use that word, that's at the center of our being. What's over here? We're very
Yeah.
concerned with what's over there. A little bit over there is like our thoughts and emotions. A little bit more over there are like our philosophical views. A little bit more over there is the actual world and other people and stuff. But what's over here? That's what Buddhism is about. This path. This is the spiritual path, not going somewhere to Tibet or Sri Lanka and learning from some bald person. It's not about that. It's about learning techniques, adopting views that support a progressively deeper and more subtle understanding of our own internal processes and selves in quotation marks.
Yeah, because you talked about the thoughts, feelings, emotions, and memories that we have. The problem is that we are often immersed in them, right? Like we experience life from them. But one of the amazing things we can do through meditation and through analytical contemplation like this is that we kind of put them in front of us. Like, oh, I remember when I first started meditation practice, it was so liberating and amazing to realize these fucking thoughts were not me, that they're just happening constantly and they won't shut the hell up even when I want them to. But at least they're not me. Like when I sat there long enough to look at the thoughts and watch them come, I'm like, I'm not doing this. They're just coming. And these thoughts are endless. And so immediately I started to have some distance from
Exactly.
that thing that I thought was me. Now I see, oh, that's actually an object in my experience. The thing I thought was I is actually an object. And just that separation changes everything.
It does change everything. It's not a goal in itself, but it is a step on the path. You have to realize, wow, I'm not my body. Everyone knows this intellectually, but when
Yeah.
you really start to explore that, you're like, whoa, I'm not my voice. I'm not my ideas. I'm not my personality. I'm not my thoughts, just like you said. That's a very profound insight. And then we don't just rest with that. Oh, I'm not my thoughts. Good. We then go deeper. We cut a more fine distinction. And then we explore, like, okay, if I'm not my thoughts, what am I? Right? And this is the process of meditation. This is the process of exploration that leads to the real freedom. Right? So we can't just accept it. We're not supposed to. The Buddha himself said, don't just believe what I say. You need to use these as guideposts to do your own exploration. And that's why Buddhism is such an interesting religion, because it doesn't matter what you believe, right? I know Buddhists who believe in karma. I know Buddhists who apparently don't. I think that's very strange, but they don't. I know Buddhists who believe in rebirth, which is what the Buddha taught. And I know Buddhists who say that rebirth is not real. Okay, right?
Mhm.
But whatever you believe, that's also out there. What's over here? That's the question of meditation. It's the question of life. What
Yeah.
am I really? When all these external things that are constantly changing are stripped off. And that process of becoming more and more subtle in our understanding of ourselves, again, I use that word because it's what people use, is supported by and actually unfolded by the Eightfold Path. And all the Buddhist teachings, all the teachings of all religions have to do with this ultimately, if you look at it from that perspective.
I really like that you mentioned that you had one teacher who said that if you don't have the right view, all meditation is wrong. I think that's really helpful because um, you know, I also heard Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche say, like if you just did practice, but you never did study, you would never do the right thing because you wouldn't know what you were doing and you wouldn't know what your goal was. And so it is so helpful and important. And often I know in the Nyingma school, especially, there can be a downplay of the philosophical side of Buddha Dharma. But it's really important, I think, to have at least a pretty basic understanding of these logical explanations of why the Buddha said what he said and why it's true. And spending some time chewing on this like Madhyamaka, the Prajnaparamita Sutras, to get some understanding of what the Buddha was actually claiming, and then you can check that, as you said, for yourself. You don't have to believe anybody else.
Right.
All you have to have is an open enough mind to say, well, is what he's saying true and accurate in my experience, and trying it out.
And that unfolds as you do it, right? We become more
Yeah.
subtle in our ability to analyze whether these things are true. And my experience of 35 years of practicing Buddhism is that they really are true. And it
Yeah.
gives your whole life a structure that's very nice. Doesn't mean everybody needs to become Buddhist, but everyone needs to become Buddha,
Yeah.
awaken, right? And it's not necessary to pin the label on yourself. Oh, Joe Wagner, I'm from Denver, I'm a Buddhist. But it is necessary to work toward becoming awakened, to becoming to seeing things as they are. Just that insight alone removes all of our suffering if done completely, and most of our suffering if done pretty well, and some of our suffering if done just a little. Just to realize, as you said, that you're not your thoughts. Holy moly, right? That is an incredible thing. And then you're not as guilty about it. Like, oh, but I keep having these negative thoughts. So what, right? The sky keeps being blue too. That's all right also. It
Yeah.
almost doesn't have to do with us. But it doesn't mean that we can't apply ourselves to refine and separate from that which leads to insight and joy and peace and freedom, and from those things that lead the opposite direction. And that's what things like right livelihood and right action are about.
Yeah, because when we have this distance from our thoughts and emotions, we realize that everything becomes workable, right? Now we can do something about it. It's not just who I am, because, how many times you hear people say that, I can't help it. That's just who I am, right? Like we have this idea that we are these things and they're intractable truths about our nature. But the good news of Buddhism is that we aren't those things, and that those things are changing like everything else. And therefore, we have some ability to work with those things. And so the rest of the Eightfold Path, in terms of having right behavior, right speech, right livelihood, is possible because you are not those things, because you are able to work with them. That's
Well said.
amazing.
It is. I think that one of the things I want to cover in this series about the Eightfold Path is, what are we supposed to do? Because we don't want to just say it's really important to have right view. Good luck. How do we actually practice right view? What we need to do is we need to study, and many people who've finished school, myself, I'm not anxious to be back in school. That might not be the right word, but we need to explore uh, at least three aspects of the Dharma in order to get an idea of what right view is, and to be able to implement it. And I think that one is the Four Noble Truths. We need to understand what the Buddha actually said. In his first discussion of this, he said, there's suffering. Suffering's got a cause, and the cause is grasping. It can be broken through. We can liberate ourselves from this. And there's a method. That method is following the Eightfold Path. That's in brief, the Four Noble Truths. We really need to study that. And we need, and for most people, and I say this to most Buddhists because I'm surprised how many Buddhists do not believe the first noble truth. That dukkha, that dissatisfaction, is part of our experience. I know a lot of people saying like, yeah, that's what the Buddha said, but because we got AI, we're gonna fix that, or some kind of hilarious thing. It's very important to really study this and put some pressure on that and really determine, is it true or not?
Yeah.
What does he actually mean? You got to study this stuff. Otherwise, you have no basis for it. It's also important to really, and can be quite painful for people, to really look as in the same way Toku said about the Dzogchen view, short periods, but intensely, and with all you got, into impermanence. Impermanence is something that I've heard several lamas say the most important thought you can have is everything is impermanent. Nothing lasts. And it is crucial to living an authentic life. We have to look into the fact that nothing lasts. Not only does this book not last, eventually it will be destroyed by water and being torn up and being ground up and recycled or whatever. But also our own bodies and minds are like that. Our ideas. Think about something you believed very strongly for a long time, and then you don't believe it anymore. Oh my God. We really have to put some energy into getting this sense of impermanence. And that, as you said, similar to coming to see that you're not your thoughts, just recognizing that everything is impermanent is a tremendously freeing thing. At first we think, well, oh my God, that means my relationship's not impermanent. It means uh, my body riding bicycles is not permanent. That's all going to change. That's terrible. But it also means, once you embrace this, that all bad situations are not permanent. That, we find ourselves in a very challenging environment politically right now in the United States and in the world. That won't last. You can be sure nothing lasts. There's a tremendous amount of freedom in that. So there's a real payoff for looking at
Yeah.
it. But I tend not to because it is painful and scary. And we need to do that. And then, of course, we need to research a little bit about what non-self actually means. Does it mean that we totally don't exist? There's no actor? Or does it mean something else? It's actually quite subtle. And those three things, the Four Noble Truths, impermanence, and the nature of ourselves, those things need to be explored. And that's the way you practice right view. And that's done by reading books. It's done
Mhm.
by contemplating. There are three aspects, right? Receiving the teachings, contemplating and researching those, and then meditating on them. And we got to do all three of those. We can't just do one. If you just get it intellectually, it doesn't penetrate deeply enough to change you. If you only meditate, then as you said before, you might have a very calm mind, but you don't know what the hell's happening, so it's not very beneficial either, and so forth. So we want to have a balance, right, between intellectualizing that and looking into it with our minds. We have these incredible minds. We receive these educations. Let's use them for our benefit. Got to do that. And then we got to do a non-conceptual insight type of meditation to come to really determine, are these things true or not for us, and in what way are they true, and so forth. I wanted to say that because otherwise people have no idea how we're going to do this, and then it's just words.
And I know you have a book to recommend. I also would like to recommend His Holiness the Dalai Lama's book, How to See Yourself as You Really Are. That was a really profound book for me early on in the path for just this thing you're saying we need to understand of like how do we see who's I, and what does that mean, and how do you logically examine that, and it gives you all the things, and it's very readable. It's a little bit intellectually rigorous because the Dalai Lama is a genius, but if you take a little time and listen to it or read it, I think you'll find it really helpful to get these basics really, really well understood. And then, Joe, I know you had a book you wanted to share with us as
I want
well.
to just mention about it, but I want to follow up on what you just said. It's very good to read the best possible sources on things like this. His Holiness the Dalai Lama is not an ordinary person. He's not only is he a Buddhist monk for, you know, must be 70 years now, 75 years, and so forth, amazing things, but he's an incredibly developed human in addition to everything else. He's an enlightened being on some level, and his insight comes across in all of his works. That's why I would recommend, say, the book you just mentioned, as opposed to Why Buddhism is True. A very popular book that was on the New York Times bestseller list is a good book, but it's written by an ordinary person. The Dalai Lama is not an ordinary person. So I would recommend trying to go as close to the source as you can because, and this fits into the book I'm going to recommend, getting, using that word in its modern sense of like, oh, I got what he meant, is the key thing here. It isn't about additional concepts. We've got a lot of concepts. And many people like to read about things like quantum physics, amazing stuff. I've got some quantum physicist friends, and they always blow my mind with what they have to say. But it isn't enough to just understand it in an intellectual way. We need to penetrate. This is ourselves. If anybody's in a position to know who Joe Wagner is, it's Joe Wagner, not somebody else. You understand what I mean? So it's very important to go close to the source and to really explore this in a deep way. And the
We have to
more,
grok it.
yeah, exactly. Very well said. And I will recommend a book which I just found to have a lot of interesting aspects and has percolated through my life for a long time now. And it's this book, Divine Revelation in Pali Buddhism by Peter Masefield. Many Buddhists would find this book maybe antithetical to some of their Buddhist views, but I think if you read it with an open mind, it's very interesting. It's a study of the original discourses of the Buddha, the Nikayas, but one of his main points is that the the original teachings of the Buddha were given orally, right? And things were not written down. The Buddha said certain things during his first discourse on the Four Noble Truths to his former compatriots on the ascetic not aesthetic, ascetic path, and they were converted. And this continued. What the Buddha said, what some of his disciples said, converted. And when I say converted, through an insight, it provided an insight for the listener. And these days, that is very much missing from many people's idea of what the path is. They get most of their information from books or podcasts or something, which are mostly generated by more or less ordinary people. There is a kind of insight that can be generated simply by hearing the teachings from someone who's very advanced. That's why I recommend the book that you recommend and other books by people like the Dalai Lama or Garchen Rinpoche. These people, they know what they're talking about. They're not getting an idea and then presenting it. No matter how clearly that's done, Buddhism is like a tube that you see through the tube to the truth. And this book is extremely convincing in his ability to show you that the original discourses of the Buddha were not intellectual convincings. They were conversionary, direct revelations of the truth, in which the people who receive them, sometimes they attained the level of even arhats right on the spot during the discourse. He goes into great detail about this. Fascinating book. Fascinating. Not super easy to find, but I wanted to recommend it because it talks about just this idea of right view, and that the Buddha, by explaining it, he himself was so powerful, so clear about the truth that in many cases, people on the spot got the truth and their lives transformed right then. They didn't listen and then think about it and then apply it, which we mostly have to do. If you meet the right kinds of teachers, if you have the right kind of, if you cultivate the right kind of openness, you don't need to intellectually examine these things. You see it. And when you see it, it has an immediate effect, and you are on the path from that moment forward. So I think it's a very interesting book. I mention it because we're talking sort of things that are usually classified as Theravada teachings, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and stuff, but they are actually the whole of Buddhism and the whole of the truth that we need, which is really cool.
Well, I think that's so great. And it really points to another reason why the guru and the Lama is so important, because when you have a teacher who actually has attained these stages, as you're saying, our connection to them literally can harmonize our own insight to match theirs in an almost instantaneous way. And this is what we're trying to facilitate through our Nundro or Guru Yoga, etc. We're trying to get at this a little bit more. And it's a way of progressing. Why it's said that you can progress so much more rapidly, because, like we also have to do, like I find myself doing, like, okay, there's a wrong view throughout their day, like trying to correct each little piece one bit at a time. It takes forever. And it's, a tedious process. Of course, we have to do with mindfulness and all of those sorts of things. But then we can have this experience of seeing somebody and tapping into, I know I've had this experience with like Garchen Rinpoche. His explanation of the teachings can be so essentialized and precise that it can, you just see it instantly. You have that revelatory moment, and it wasn't an explanation. Like, he shows you in a way it's really hard to even explain. I think it's amazing.
I think that's nicely said. And I suppose I can conclude my part with a statement from a friend of mine, Eric Drew, who spent his whole entire childhood with great masters like the 16th Karmapa, and has become quite a realized being in his own right, in my opinion. He's told me once there's really two ways to relate to the Lama. You can relate to the teacher as a source of information. You go there, you meet them, they tell you things, you take those things, then you apply them in your life, you contemplate them, you work with them, and you make progress. He said that's how most people do it. But with the right kind of Lama, who you have a strong karmic connection with, and the right kind of openness and preparation on this part of oneself as the disciple, the transformation can take place instantaneously, because we are not recognizing, or we're not getting our Buddha nature from somewhere else and then putting it in, like slotting in a new memory card in our computers. It's already there. We just need to come to see how things are. The insight of the Buddha was not dependent on all that ascetic practice that he did, although without that, he wouldn't have had that insight, perhaps. What we need to do is clean up our side so that we can receive the truth, which is that we already are what we're seeking already. It's not enough to believe it. We have to be pure enough and clear enough to get that in a deep way. And that's what right view is really about.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Joe. This was really fun, and I really look forward to exploring the rest of the
Me
Eightfold Path
too.
and going over these things. And if you, our listeners, have any questions, thoughts, comments, book recommendations, please put it in the comments or send us an email, whatever. I really enjoy engaging with the community about these things. And please, as always, like, share, subscribe, help more people to find this information. They might find it useful and helpful for their path. But again, once again, I want to thank you for being here. Thank you, Joe. And
Pleasure.
we will see you next time.
Thanks a lot, Damien. Great topic.